Princess and the Glass Hill. Many, many years ago, there lived in a far-off land a farmer. And this farmer had 3 sons and a large field. Now this field was full of wheat. And the farmer was preparing to harvest the wheat. So he sent his eldest son to the barn just outside where the plot of land was with the wheat and said, "Now keep watch, for I do not want anyone to come and steal our wheat in the night." The son, being brave and strong, said, "Fear not, father. I will watch the field all night." So, taking up his position in the night, he lay down for a moment and began his vigil watch. But, in the early hours of the morning, before the sun had risen, he heard a terrible wind rattling in the barn that he was in. And then he heard a sound as though of fire coming from a far-off distance. Terror gripped his heart, and he fled from that place. This brave soul ran like the most scared small child that he had ever known. And the next day, when his father looked over the field, the wheat was entirely gone. Not so much as a grain remained. The father was crestfallen and said to his son, "This can never happen again, for if it does, we are surely ruined." So the next year, the father looked upon his eldest son with shame, and then turned to his next son and said, "The task falls to you, my son. Do not be as your brother. Stay the night, and if anyone comes and harvests our grain, you must sound the alarm." So the next brother, with courage in his heart, begins his vigil. But that night, a wind more mightier than the first year rattled the structure as though to tear it down. And it was as though all the fires of hell were descending upon the field all at once. At least that is what the son claimed later, as he too fled from that area. In the morning, as the sun was rising, the father looked over his field, once laden full of grain, and not a kernel remained. The father turned to his 2 sons and cried, "We are ruined. This can never happen again. I will go to the bankers to save our land. This one year we must pray for a harvest more bountiful than the other 2. So the father was able to provide for the field 1 more year. But he was in a terrible way, for his last son, well, no one had thought much of him to begin with. But, having no one else, the father turned from his first 2 sons and looked upon the youngest and said, "Well, I know how this is going to end, but why not?" And so, our third born begins his watch, laying in the barn, when suddenly, as the years previously, the winds begin to blow. The fire begins to crackle outside. And the third son says, "If when I run, we will be ruined, and we will lose everything. My father will die of shame, and my brothers will have nothing. I will die here. This is my end." And so he waits. But the fire does not come. So our young third-born son steps outside of the barn and looks about. And what does he see but a mighty steed, a horse, such that you have only possibly read about. And this gray steed is sitting in the field with a saddle on its back and a pack of armor. Now the boy is perplexed by this. Where could this mythical steed have come from? And what is its purpose here? But he has not time for that, for this steed has begun eating the grain. So the boy comes to this steed and he says, "I must subdue this animal and move it away from our field of grain. Otherwise this beast will devour." So taking in his hand a piece of iron, he casts it over.
The horse, yeah.
He casts it over this mighty horse.
And he said, "Stand still."
And after casting the iron over the horse and saying, "Stand still," the horse stands still. The son reaches out his hand and takes hold of the bridle. And at once, this beast is the tamest horse that you have ever known. The son then guides this animal to a secret place only he knows. In the morning, when the father comes to the field, with sorrow in his heart, for he knows what he will find, he is surprised and awestruck. The field with grain is, for all intents and purposes, full of grain. The father looks at his son and says, "You? How did this come to be?" The son simply says, "Well, I stayed the night, and nothing happened." And it follows that the next year, when the grain was due to be harvested, the father once again sent his youngest son, and much the same thing happened. And the son, after experiencing the terror of the night and wanting to run away, said, "No, this is much like before. I will not be terrified by whatever this is. I will stay the course and see what happens." And after stepping out of the barn the second time, sees another horse, a white horse. And this white horse also has a suit of armor, much similar to the first, but yet different in color and make. The boy, then, taking a piece of iron in his hand, he casts it over the horse and commands, "Stand still!" And the horse immediately becomes as tame as any trained horse that has ever been. And taking the bridle, the boy leads the horse to a secret place that only he knows. And thus, this happens a third year. The boy, after waiting in the barn and receiving all of the terrors of the night, waits and obtains a black horse of the same make and model of the armor. Now, why a boy needs 3 pairs of armor and 3 horses is beyond me. But that is the story, apparently, that we have, so be it. Now, in another part of that kingdom, there lived a princess who was most unhappy because, after being born as one of the wealthiest young individuals in the land, and being one of the most well taken care of people that has been in that part of the kingdom, her father came to her and told her, "You must marry, for I wish to form an alliance with Kingdom," and then we forget the name of whoever that was, because that's not going to work out, obviously. And the princess, of course, says to her father, "Father, do not force me to marry this knight from this other kingdom, for I do not love this man. Listen to my words now, for I propose this. I will stand on top of a glass hill. Whoever receives the golden apple from my hand, and after climbing the hill, that no knight has ever been able to climb in their armor, I will marry that man. For at least we will then prove that this knight is sound of courage, strength, and skill." And so the father says, "This is ridiculous. I should make you marry this man because this is the most ridiculous thing ever. But fine. You will sit on the top of this hill, and when no one else is able to achieve this challenge, you will marry the knight that I want. But if anyone accomplishes this impossible task, not only will you marry him, but
I'll give him half of my kingdom.
I will give him half of my kingdom." And so it was that our princess ends up on a glass hill in the middle of a ridiculous challenge with 3 golden apples in hand. All the knights gather. The strong, the intelligent, the skillful, the cunning, and the downright crafty. The first make it up the hill part way. The second don't make it up the hill very much farther. And the third, well, they turned back and went home and didn't make it at all. And so, after trying and trying, this group is gathered at the bottom, ready to declare defeat, when suddenly a mysterious knight in golden armor on a gray horse rides in. The knights call out to this newcomer, "Stop! Don't bother! We've already proven that the task is impossible." But the knight carries on. He makes it halfway up, as the others had done, and then a bit farther. And then, upon his mighty, majestic, and some would say almost mystical steed. Magical, yes. He makes it a bit farther, and then he's almost at the top. The princess, looking upon him and being so excited, casts the first apple. This apple flies out and lands. Where should it land? It lands in the knight's boot. The knight, having the apple, turns around and goes down. Now, the father is first perplexed and then a little irritated. And then he's downright angry. Because not only has someone proved that a knight can get farther on the glass hill than any other knight before, but then the knight turns around and doesn't even give the father the privilege of knowing who he is. So the father says to the princess, "Well, it seems that it's almost possible." And the princess says, "I think that knight would have done it." And the father says, "Fine, we will do this test again." On day 2, the knights gather around and they say, "If that fellow can do it, we can do it too." So the knights all begin again. The brave, the intelligent, the skillful, and the downright crafty. And once more, they make it up the hill, halfway. Not so much for the last group. And then, being more humiliated than the day before, they gather at the bottom and shout out to the newcomer riding in their direction, wearing a golden suit of armor and upon a white horse. There's, no, the other fellow who was here yesterday, who almost won, we haven't seen him today and he's probably not coming. What are you doing here? The task is now proved to be impossible. But our golden knight rides on his white horse. He rides and gets halfway up the hill, as the others, some of whom had done. And then he gets a bit farther, and almost to where the princess stands. The princess casts out the apple, at which his gloved hand reaches out and catches, and then he puts in his boot, and turns, just a few feet from the princess. He turns, and goes back down the hill. And all the knights cry out, "Who are you?" The king cries out in an even louder voice, "Who is that fellow? Catch him!" And the knights give chase, but with little effort, the stranger evades them and is gone. The king is truly furious. Not only has a knight proved his task to be possible when it's supposed to be impossible, all of his knights in the realm can't even catch a fellow when he commands them to catch him. So the king goes to his daughter and says to her, "One more day, and if no knight stands beside you and takes the apple from your hand, you will marry the prince that I desire you to marry." And so they gather on the 3rd day. The princess on the top of the glass hill, and all of the knights in the kingdom at the bottom. And so it begins again. The knights, the cunning, the crafty, the skillful, the intelligent, in whatever order they can, now not caring for ceremony or decorum, begin to get up the hill. They get up to a quarter, and then nearly half, and no one even gets to half. Then gathering at the bottom, they grumble and say, "Well, maybe the fellow in the silver or gold armor will come," but none of those two came. Instead, a knight on a black horse with similar make but distinctly different armor runs into the camp. He's at the foot of the hill, a quarter, half. He gets up to the 3/4 mark. And then he stands beside our princess. He reaches down, and she reaches up, and hands him, from her own hand, the apple that she was holding. The king comes out of his pavilion. He runs toward the man. He says, "Seize that man!" But once more, the knight turns. And upon his mystical, some would say magical, steed is gone. Disappeared. So this leaves the king in a state of fury. "I want one of these 3 knights to come here immediately," he said. And at this point, I think the king should be trying to execute some of his knights who failed to catch this fellow. Does anyone have a version of that story where this happens? No? All right. And then, so it came to pass that the next day, the princess goes to her father and says, "Father, the impossible task which you have deemed impossible has been proven to be possible. And so, as we agreed, I will not marry the man that you desired." And so it came to pass that the father agreed, and the princess became free to marry whom she would. And thus our story ends. Well, I guess we should jump back to the part where our strange young fellow, 3rd son and all, is in the middle of the field with 3 suits of armor and 3 horses. Now, what is this young fellow to do? After all, he has also 3 golden apples. And, don't miss my guess, he has a date with the princess.